Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for our second webinar of the year for the Sexualities and Genders Research Group at Western Sydney Uni. I'd like to start the meeting by acknowledging the traditional owners, custodians and elders of the land that we are all probably on, unless anybody's from international place, because this is online. I'm currently on the land of the Wurundjeri in what's now known as Melbourne. But I also acknowledge that at Western Sydney, with our 13 campuses, we work over the lands of the Indigenous nations of the Darug, the Gundungurra, the Dawal, the Wiradjuri, and the Bunjalung. So, and then I also live on other lands. So we traverse the lands of a great deal of Indigenous nations. Yesterday was Sorry Day. So just a special reminder that Sorry Day acknowledges the terrible harms that were done in separating, stealing children and separating them from their parents, their culture, historically as part of colonization. And just to acknowledge that this is stolen land, always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. And of course, it's Reconciliation Week starting today. So there's a lot happening at the moment and some really great online content out there if you're interested in all of these issues. So welcome to our webinar. I am delighted to introduce to you today to launch, again, they've already launched it, but we're doing an academic launch this time, to launch the incredible report, Home is Where Our Story Begins. And presenting that report to you today, and they will talk to you more about the co-authors when they do so, is the incredible and rather prolific member of our Sexualities and Genders Research Group, Nicole Asquith, who is an Associate Professor of Policing and Criminal Justice with us here at Western Sydney. She is also co-director of the Vulnerability, Resilience and Policing Research Consortium and Senior Research Fellow with the Tasmania Institute of Law Enforcement Studies. Nicole is also the Secretary of the Australian Hate Crime Network and co-convener of the New South Wales LGBTIQ Domestic and Family Violence Interagency. She has worked with policing organisations for over 20 years to develop better victim services and policing processes for vulnerable victims and offenders. In addition to her work with Australian and UK policing services on hate crime, and in her spare time that she has after doing all of this, she's currently working with criminal justice stakeholders on strategies for reducing victim and offender vulnerability and the unique characteristics of rural and remote policing. So Nicole is the chief author of the report that is being launched today. We also have co-presenting Erdem Yigiter, who is a queer advocate for Greater Western Sydney's LGBTIQ+ community, and amazingly is a queer representative for Western Sydney University's Student Representative Council and the president of the Queer Collective for both of the Parramatta campuses. So I'm going to hand over to Nicole to introduce to you, just to let you all know, attendees, that we do have Q&A available. So after the presentation, if you type questions in the open Q&A, we'll address them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. If you could take down the shared screen that you've got at the moment. And thank you, Lucy and Chris, for organising the seminar. As Lucy mentioned, we did launch this project about 10 days ago now to the community, and we had a webinar on Ida Hobbit to present the findings, and we had 160 people attend that webinar, which was amazing, and most of those were service providers and stakeholders in this research. Before I begin, before I put up the slides, I wanted to share one of the outputs from the research, which is a video we created, well, our intern Fernanda created with a couple of artists. So I just want to share that first before I get on to the rest of the presentation.
November 2017. After 12 months of debate, Australia opened the vote for marriage equality.
For the national results, yes responses, 7 million applicants.
Despite the overall yes vote, 17 electorates in Australia returned a majority no. Out of these 17 electorates, 12 were located in Greater Western Sydney. We asked sexuality and gender diverse, culturally and linguistically diverse people who are living in Western Sydney to share their stories with us.
The constant discussion about the debate, even the positive ones, were emotionally exhausting. It felt like everyone had an opinion on your personal life.
I never really trusted the government, but I just feel disillusioned even more so. Also, I look at, even in the suburb that I live in, and I'm like, I don't trust any one of you. There's a resentment there because I know what you tried to do to me and people like me.
What many people may not have thought about is how the public debate affected families.
The plebiscite sent my family into a moral panic. This led my parents to paranoia, taking extra precaution to police me from the outside world. I was not allowed on social media, had my internet privileges taken away, and they monitored my whereabouts at almost every moment of the day.
Feeling alienated from family or culture, or feeling torn between culture, religion, and tradition in our identity as queer people impacts substantially on our well-being, mental, emotional, and even financial. We cannot rely on families in a way that straight people take for granted, and for those of us from CALD backgrounds, we can never feel fully at home in either our heritage culture, nor in Australian society, and even in the Australian queer community.
The material that came out really drove the homophobia in my family. Religious content, false statistics. It was really heartbreaking to see your family in the same sentence say they love you unconditionally, but then say they will never accept your sexuality.
For the first time I showed my parents my vulnerability. I didn't have a choice. It was oozing out, did not cope, and they really looked after me. Some of my cousins had big arguments on my behalf with their parents. My immediate family went really out of their way to support me.
Family and community support is critical to the well-being of sexuality and gender diverse people.
The worst thing about the marriage equality campaign was that there were no services out west and no obvious places for us to turn. We live in the places where the no votes were highest, but the support was focused on the places where the yes vote was sure or on the fence.
I think it's important that we have these services, especially out west, for the LGBT community, because when I was younger and I wanted to find other trans people, there was a group in Bankstown where I grew up that existed, and I was like the only person who came. But through that group, I was able to find things like 2010 or other youth groups that might be a little bit more popular. And I think it's just important for these types of things to exist, and especially when people are still finding themselves when they're still at a very young age.
Services can be inclusive of the LGBTQ community through simple means such as visibly showing the support by registering the location as a safe space. This simple act can turn a service that is neutral towards the LGBT community into an ally.
I think it's very important for services to have some greater awareness and some knowledge and education of understanding the community from the LGBTIQ. There are people out there who are suffering because they're living in shame and because they're not accepted from their family or from their friends.
As a queer person of colour, I think it's really important for communities to be consulted. I think it's really important when I walk into an organisation and see people of colour as a representation of the organisation. Beyond that, though, I think it's really important for professionals to be well trained or well informed in cultural awareness and cultural sensitivities.
Our services that target us and our community, absolutely should not underestimate how deep homophobia still runs in Western Sydney. But the community can do a whole lot more to seriously engage with people about their beliefs and about the queer people who walk among them.
Discrimination and family violence are social problems. Every one of us has a role to play in making our communities safe for everyone. These voices are part of a community capacity building project, Home is Where Our Story Begins, To read more and learn about what you can do, visit sayitoutloud.org.au/homeis.
Hope everybody's doing well after that video. I should have given you a bit of a trigger warning because even the project team gets a little teary over that video. Just share my screen for the presentation. So I'd like to acknowledge that Erdem Yigiter was in that video and he was also part of the team. So we invited him along to participate in today's presentation, given that he is a Western Sydney University student. He was part of the project and he is a convener of the Queer Collective on campus. So just to start off with, I want to acknowledge that the project was funded by the LGBTIQ Domestic and Family Violence Interagency, along with the City of Parramatta that gave us a community capacity building grant, and Western Sydney University gave matched funding. ACON provided support in terms of our outputs such as the video as well as the report. We'd also like to thank, of course, all of the survey participants and interviewees, and importantly our interns, including Erdem, but also Fernanda, Gunit and Lisa, who played an important role in the community capacity building components of the project. I'd also like to acknowledge the artists, Wally and Missy, who provided report illustrations and video graphics, and to Fernanda, Damien and the video participants for adding their voices to the video in the end. So, as most of you would know, particularly since you just watched the video, the marriage equality debate had a huge impact on people in Greater Western Sydney. Not only did we have the 2 months of the campaigning, but we had the 12 months prior to that with the public debate that was often quite virulent in its homophobia and transphobia. Whilst 80% participated in that public vote, and the vote was in the affirmative in 61.6%, not all communities supported that. And we saw that in the video with 12 of the 17 electorates that voted no were based in Greater Western Sydney. And as you can see from these statistics on the slide, there was a really significant no vote. As you can see from Parramatta, around 38%. Sorry, I've just got a phone going off at me. Hold on. Parramatta at 38%, Blaxland at 26% compared to the Sydney electorate, which was around 84%. So those results gave us all a little pause for thought about the impact of that debate on LGBTIQ people in Greater Western Sydney, and particularly the impact on culturally and linguistically diverse queer people. So the members of the interagency approached me to try and do a project in time for the first year anniversary of the vote. That came and went, and I'll talk about why that happened in a moment, but we were able to get it just after the second anniversary of that vote. I wanted just to do a quick snapshot of what we know in this field, and I'm sure many of you would know a lot of this research, but what we found both through the review of the existing research, but also through our own study, was that relationships to family are essential to the health and well-being of LGBTIQ people. And that for some culturally and linguistically diverse families, they don't have the knowledge or experience to work within their culture to address their family members, their sons, their daughters' sexuality or gender identity. So often there is this sense for CALD people that they have to make decisions or balance two different conflicting social networks. One is around their sense of connection to their culture and community, and the other is the connection to the LGBTIQ community. And often they have to manage these, and they do so by avoiding being out at sexuality and gender diverse events, or use discretion when they discuss their relationships and friendships. And dialogua talks about this as playing the game, about knowing, not knowing, and pretending not to know. And a lot of our research findings actually talk directly to this concept of knowing, not knowing, and pretending not to know. So this balancing act meant that some participants had to come out, stay in, and stepping in and out of the closet, or as one of our participants talked about, as well as the research talks about, inviting in those people that they feel safe to disclose their sexuality or gender diversity. There's also quite a significant amount of research that talks about the impact of not having family support, not only during that coming out process, but in the longer term. And social support can provide, in some respects, a preventative measure, particularly in times of prejudice, such as the marriage equality debate. We also know from the research that there are a whole range of pathological behaviours that are increased when we don't have family and social support. Catwise et al. Found that illegal drug use was less likely if a queer person was connected to their mother in particular and had support from their mother, but also that family support and acceptance reduced the levels of depression, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation. Krishnan also found that for transgender and non-binary people, the level of suicidality drops from 41% to 4% when there is family support for that coming out process. And also that we find similar findings in terms of the long-term well-being of Indigenous sister girls if there is family support. There is also, on the other side, that there was some really good responses from family, but a lot of those responses were about avoidance and distancing and disengagement. And as you'll see in our research findings, our research aligns with those 4 different dominant family responses of, support through action, support that preserves the kinship bond, avoidance and distancing. Importantly, Our Watch, which is a premier organisation around family and domestic violence, admitted as late as 2017 that they know nothing about LGBTIQ family violence, and that this is one of the biggest gaps in the literature around family and domestic violence. Our participants and those in previous research often experience heterosexist and cissexist violence from their families, including quite a significant number of people who are exiled from their family, forced to marry. We've seen cases of homicide, and one of the critical issues which Erdem's going to talk to later on is around conversion therapy. Queer people of colour experience much higher levels of family exile and homelessness than their white counterparts. And Eaton and Rios found that the majority of the negative family responses originated from mothers. And this is a really interesting finding, though it is a study particularly of Latino and Latina and Latinx families. We did not find the same thing. In fact, the majority of perpetrators of family violence were fathers, brothers, stepfathers, grandfathers, and uncles. Pastrana found also that as the strength of the religious faith increases, the outness levels decrease. For me, coming to this research almost took me back to an earlier study that I was doing in hate crime, and I was given access to 100,000 hate crime files from UK policing services. And within that data set, there was quite a significant set of outliers. And when I drilled down to look at what these outliers were, they were in fact what I call intrafamilial hate crime. This is hate, violence and hate crime committed against members of their families, usually during the coming out process, or when meeting partners, or when somebody's getting married, those key events in a family life. And this intrafamilial hate crime has really strong links to what's called honour-based violence. Honour-based violence is often framed as an issue for Muslim communities, but what we find both in this study but also in my previous research is that religious affiliation has very little to do with honour-based violence. The honour is an issue in all aspects of family relationships, and whether that comes to the fore or not, again, relates back to the level of religiosity, sorry for that. So the project was funded under a community capacity building grant, so the research component is only a small aspect of that. Sorry, I've just noticed that there's some messages coming up and I'm not sure if I need to actually say anything to those responses.
No,
okay.
that's
all right.
Cool. Trying to elicit questions for later.
Okay, no worries. Tell me if you need to interrupt me. No. So the project as a whole involved 5 components. There was a survey of sexuality and gender diverse CALD people about their relationships to family. We also aim to have recorded life history interviews with some of those survey participants. We have developed, and this is an ongoing process of developing a community database of allied organisations in Greater Western Sydney. And just to give you a sense, as I mentioned earlier, we had the Ida Hobbit event last week and there was 160 participants, and most of those were from services and stakeholders. We've also held 2 community forums, one that Erdem organised last year during Ida Hobbit with the Queer Collective, and this year when we launched the report. We've also had various stakeholder forums and training. This is something that we've been doing ongoing through the interagency at our monthly meetings. I have to say there were a lot of barriers in conducting this research. We were in ethics in total for about 9 months because of the concerns of the ethics committee, particularly around the aspect of video recorded life history interviews. That was a tripping point for our interviews. The interviewees that we were able to recruit did not agree to video record the interviews, though they did agree to audio record, but neither of them wanted to be identified in terms of the comments that they made. So to bolster that video that you saw earlier, we did engage with some stakeholders to get some vox pop comments from them as well. To address some of the concerns of the ethics committee, we also had to integrate into our survey and interviewee schedules what we call a safety checklist. And this was a series of questions asking about their experiences of family violence and distress and anxiety in the previous 6 months. And if they answered yes to those questions, then we asked them to just take a few moments to think about whether it is the right time to participate in this research. There was 134 people who started the survey. About 60 of those did not meet the inclusion criteria, particularly the culturally and linguistically diverse. So we know that in future, if we do a study, there is a lot more people who do not identify as CALD who would be interested in voicing their experiences about family violence. One of the other things that really concerned the project team at the very beginning was the fact that the 4 key researchers were all white and cisgender. So one of the first steps we took in the project, particularly around the community capacity building aspects, was to appoint 4 CALD and SGD interns to help guide the project. And those were paid internships. We didn't ask them to volunteer their labour. But as you can see, Erdem is still being involved in the project and he is definitely not being paid anymore. But it was really integral to the project to have their input right from the very beginning of the survey production, the interview schedules, right through the whole project to the report itself. As I said, we did the safety checklist, and I have to say that even those preliminary findings were quite sobering. So about 8% had experienced family violence in the 6 months prior to participating. 10% were afraid of their family, and 18% said that their safety would be at risk if their family knew that they were participating in this research. So I think that's really significant to point to some of the barriers of engaging this hard to reach community within a hard to reach community within a hard to reach community. So what we've learned from this process of doing this research is that we need to devote a lot more lead-in time to building the capacity of organisations and services, as well as members of the community, to actually participate in the project. We now know that there's a lot of goodwill out in Western Sydney to build the capacity around sexuality and gender diversity, but at the time when we started this project, there was almost nobody talking about these issues. So even just doing the project, we've actually brought these issues onto the agenda. So just to give you a sense of our participants, in total we had 60 survey participants and 2 interviewees, and participants' demographics were varied across the board, not only in terms of gender and sexuality, but also in terms of ethnicity and religion, and also in terms of their links to Greater Western Sydney. As you can see, the majority of our participants were cisgender. However, I have to note that we do have 15% of our participants identified as trans or gender diverse, which is actually quite a high proportion of participants in our study, in studies of this kind, sorry. In terms of sexuality, what we found was that the younger the participant, the less likely that they identified as lesbian and gay, and the more likely that they identified as bisexual, queer, asexual, or pansexual. In terms of that 8% other, the majority of those responses were either heterosexual or androphilic. So just to try and capture the variety, in our report, we talk a little bit more about those other experiences as well. One of the critical points that was raised by some of our participants was the need to ensure that we were culturally competent in reporting our results, so as to reduce the possibility of further pathologising and demonising culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And it was really interesting in the early part of this study when I talked to outsiders about this project, immediately the response was conventionally, oh yes, it's really hard for Muslim queers. And it was always this sense that Muslim families were less likely to be supportive of their queer family members. But as you can see from this, our participants came from a variety of religious backgrounds, and that the majority of them were in fact Christian. As you can see from the left-hand side, we had participants from around the world. There were no overrepresented groups within that. Though the majority of participants were from a mixed heritage, usually with a white Australian parent and a culturally and linguistically diverse parent. Though we did have some additional responses from Cambodian, Vietnamese and Lebanese Australians in the report. So just a quick overview of the quantitative findings. I want to really focus on the qualitative findings because they tell the story of our participants, as opposed to the quite sobering statistics in regards to family violence. So one of the key things that overlay all of the research findings was this notion of minority stress. And this is the psychological and psychic labour that is required to manage other people's prejudice and intolerance. And not only does it impact psychologically, but it also has physiological impacts as well, particularly around high blood pressure and hypertension and those sorts of things. So in terms of our research, around a third of our participants have not come out at all to their family. And of those third of participants, 3/4 of them have no intention ever to come out to their family. So we have quite a significant group of people within the culturally and linguistically diverse queer community that will not engage their families around these issues and therefore may not have that support of their families in the coming out process. Of those that have come out to their families, 53% indicated that the disclosure had led to a deterioration in their family relationships, and over their lifetime, 43% of our participants had experienced family violence of one form or another. And as you can see from one of our participants, my household disowned me and asked me to move out and leave the family home. It has now been 13 years since I last spoke or saw my mother or brother. You can also see from the right-hand side the experiences of family violence. The majority of that was around verbal abuse, but it's important to note the exclusion and exile from family. So exclusion is exclusion from family events. In particular, participants talked about being asked not to attend religious and cultural events after they'd come out. And we're looking at about 17% of our participants were thrown out of home as a result of that coming out process. Important to note that there was still quite a significant 13% of our participants had been forced into conversion therapy. So I want to talk to you about some of the themes that came out of our research, and we're bookending them with the two positive themes, and the ones in the middle are a bit negative responses. And we're also separated the themes from the coming out key themes and the marriage equality key themes, because these differ just a little bit. So one of the most important findings is that a majority of our participants had not experienced violence, and in fact had experienced increased intimacy through the transparency about their sexuality and gender identity with their families. And this led to increased closeness and trust with their relatives. And of course, during the marriage equality debate, it provided a support network for those participants. As one of our participants said, disclosing it to them and finally embracing who I am as a gay individual made them realise more about the LGBT community and the way in which gay people are either treated or showed in society. I really believe it broadened their understanding of me as being a gay person, made them see the world differently and how there are different people and different values in life. And one of the small little snippets of stories that one of our participants talked about was their father was quite confronted during the coming out process, but after discussing it with him, in the longer term, he now has a father who shows his support by finding and recommending gay-themed movies. So little acts of support really had a huge impact on our participants' well-being. However, there was a lot of participants who, when they did come out, were faced with disappointment, shock and guilt expressed by their families. And there was almost a sense that for some of our participants' families that they had done something wrong, that there was something in their parenting style that had led to this outcome. There was also not only the disappointment, shock and guilt expressed by the families, but our participants also talked about their own shame in that coming out process, the shame of not being the heterosexual child that their parents wanted. And many of our participants talked about the really critical importance of the heterosexual marriage and the children and the grandchildren to their cultural family expression. And they felt guilty about not being able to live up to that experience and that need from their families. As one of our interviewees said, my sister was horrified about it. She screamed at me. She said, "You are a disgrace, like mum's going to kill herself because of you." Like, she tried to invalidate it really quickly. Also, she was disgusted by it. She's like, "I just want a normal family," is what she wanted. I understood where that came from, because growing up, that's all we wanted. But it was extremely hurtful because she's my sister and I always thought I could be myself with her. So it shocked me. It changed our relationship. A second negative theme that came out from the research, and this sort of links back to the existing research, was this a taboo met with silence. That after building up the courage to come out to their families, they were met with silence from their families and often denial of even that coming out process. So participants often used discretion in order to preserve their well-being and out of respect for their religious community. This silence and denial at the stage of coming out often returned again during the marriage equality debate, where it could no longer be ignored. So as one of our non-binary participants discussed, They ignored it completely. My father pretended to forget my coming out because he refused to acknowledge it. My mother didn't speak about it. And another participant, again non-binary, shocked when I came out as gay first. Mum felt she did something wrong. Parents never talk about coming out or sexuality. And I'll hand over to Erdem for this one, because this is something that he has lived experience of that I think is really important to frame in terms of our participants' responses.
Hi all, can you hear me? Just checking. Yep. Okay, so being CALD and coming out as sexuality and gender diverse in Greater Western Sydney resulted in participants feeling a disconnection between their cultural identity and their sexual identity. Participants often felt they had two options. They could live in the inner city and be near sexuality and gender diverse services and have the sexuality and gender accepted by the white SGD community, or remain in Western Sydney and be culturally connected to family and community. Being openly sexuality and gender diverse, engaging with the sexuality and gender diverse community led to feeling a distinct disconnect to cultural heritage for some participants. The alternative choice was living in Western Sydney near family, where they had access to financial support, culture, and community. By living close to family, participants knew they would face a distinct lack of SGD services, often feeling isolated as an SGD person, and feeling pressure to keep their gender or sexuality discreet. Those currently living in Greater Western Sydney voiced a feeling of being left behind and invisible to the mainstream sexuality and gender diverse services in the city, and noting the distinct lack of resources for the large Western Sydney population. Participants also discussed their experiences of racism and discrimination that they faced from the broader community, including the sexuality and gender diverse community. One participant commented that their family's support of marriage equality felt really important, while another participant specifically highlighted their concerns that this project could contribute to the racism and discrimination that CALD communities face. I'm just going to quote, while I think this is a useful piece of research, I'm a bit concerned about the framing of the questions. Why people don't get asked to participate in surveys about how homophobic their families are and have their culture or religion brought up as a factor. Many queer people of colour that I know have close and stable relationships with their family members who are not supportive of LGBTIQ communities. Of course, there are families who are homophobic and violent, but I think it's important for the nuance of the situation to be respected. If a report comes out of this research showing that Western Sydney communities of colour are homophobic and violent, this could end up increasing the racism and discrimination that we are all already facing. So I would like to say a few things about this topic too, because much of this presentation closely relates to my life. So being born to migrant parents as a first-generation Australian, I already felt the divide between my cultural identity. I went to a primary school in the West, and by the time I was in high school, my family and family friends would all feel overwhelmingly ethnic to me. This divide was further exaggerated when I discovered my sexuality at the start of high school. But during this time, I discovered that I didn't want to live in the West because I felt there was a high concentration of ethnicities that aren't typically gay-friendly in this area. I felt I couldn't properly come out in the West either, and I felt much more free to express myself in the city. I went through high school without knowing that there was any support services, and I felt the only support service that was available that I knew of was 2010 in Newtown, which again is closer to the city. And even now, 10 years after I first came out to my family, I have to go back into the closet when my mother's friends come around and ask me when I'm getting married. So that's what Nicole talked about earlier with the coming in and out of the closet.
Thanks, Erdem. Just moving on to the marriage equality debate, and I mentioned this earlier that one of the key themes was breaking the silence. This was not only for those, breaking the silence was not only for those who had come out and been faced with denial and silence from their parents, but also for some of our participants who had not come out. The marriage equality debate enabled them to almost test the waters, that they could raise the issue at the family dinner table to say, you know, well, what do you think about this? To get a sense of how possibly they may react to their own coming out stories at a later stage. For some of our participants, this was an incredibly transformative experience, that the marriage equality debate enabled them to actually say those things that they were not able to say earlier. But for others, it created an incredibly hostile environment. So one of our participants says, it strengthened my belief in them as they grew better to understand the plight of many LGBTIQ people. However, our interviewee talked about how I had already come out to my family. So this created more tension because they were sort of happy to live in denial. And so like everyone was talking about it. So the denial became more suffocating. They didn't like that they even had to think about this. And this was a really important finding from the research, that often it can be external events that prompt people to come out, but also enable people to test the waters before they do actually come out fully to their parents. Another negative finding from the marriage equality debate questions was that the debate enabled their prejudiced family members to almost reveal and legitimise this in a broader framework. And in particular, our participants talked about the need to manage their social media profiles really closely and curate who was seeing what post and when. Some of our participants talked about that their family member would say something incredibly awful around the marriage equality debate and around LGBTIQ people. And they would respond, and their family member would say, well, we're not talking about you. It's not you. We love you. So there was also this sense of almost bracketing off their family member as something distinct from all of those other queer people who are seeking marriage equality. So it did create a lot of conflict within families, and it meant that some of our participants had to choose to self-exile from their family, to leave the family home, or to spend time away from those families and discussions of the topic. So whilst in the previous theme we found that the breaking of the silence opened up opportunities, in this theme we saw that it particularly our participants talked about having the government put it to a public debate meant that there was two sides to the issue, and so it almost legitimised their families' responses, because they could say, well, you know, the government at least says that it's all right to say no. So as you can see from our participants' comments, extended families seem to think it gave them a green light to voice negative opinions or post negative things on social media. And when challenged about it, would respond with things like, oh, but I don't mean you. And one of our Tongan participants, religious content that false statistics. It was really heartbreaking to see your family in the same sentence say they love you unconditionally, but then say they will never accept your sexuality. Another aspect to the response to the marriage equality debate was this sense of queer people as being collateral damage in this democratic process, that there was a significant hit taken to the health and well-being of sexuality and gender diverse people in Greater Western Sydney. And for some of our participants, they became the target not only of their families' negative response to the campaign, but also within their workplaces. And a couple of our participants who work in Catholic schools talked about the fact that they were only approved to promote the Yes campaign, and if they said anything, promote the No campaign, and if they said anything about voting yes, then they would be subject to disciplinary procedures. So a lot of LGBTIQ people felt that they were thrown under the bus during this process. As our interviewee said, the plebiscite was really upsetting and very othering and scary. I felt like we were just sort of having to fight for our lives. So I just retained a lot of anger when it happened, and I never really got to express it because I'm not really in an environment where I can freely express those kinds of ideas and feelings. And from another Tongan participant, the marriage equality campaign made my everyday life a hostile one because people knew I was gay. A lot of their anger was focused on me. And that was one of the aspects of the debate, was that for some of our participants, they were the only out queer person in their family and social networks. And even in terms of positive responses, they were the focus of their family and community's attention. Of course, in terms of the negative responses, that would have had a huge impact on health and well-being. And finally, the final theme, and again, I'm returning to one of the more positive aspects of the research, was the notion of active resistance. And this active resistance was not only in terms of explicit campaigning during the marriage equality debate, but little tiny acts of resistance within their families. You know, one of our participants talked about during the marriage equality debate, one of their aunties had asked, you know, when are you going to find a good man and get married? And she took that moment to say, I'm not going to marry a man and I will find my partner when I can. So it was these little tiny acts of pushing back against families that I think was really important for our participants' capacity to take space within their families and within their communities and to feel safe in doing so. So as one of our Turkish participants stated, had to create new ways to relate to family members that are different from cultural expectations, had to educate them about my future family life. And this is one of the things that one of the themes that threads through all of our research is about the lack of knowledge and awareness around what it means to be LGBTIQ. And importantly, what that means in terms of cultural expectations around marriage and children. As our interviewee said, outside people just sitting in a public setting, I'd overhear something and I'd have to say something and I'd regret it immediately because it was like, oh, like you don't feel safe now. But there are times I felt so compelled because it just felt so sickening. So a lot of our participants put themselves at high risk, and Rabin and Taylor talk about high risk activism around disclosing sexuality and gender diversity in campaigns and in the workplace as being high risk because you can lose everything. For some of our participants, it was about losing family. For others, it was about losing jobs. So in addition to their experiences, we asked our participants about, if you experienced family violence, who would you like to speak with? What are the best services for you? And overall, the preference was for sexuality and gender diverse services over culturally and linguistically diverse services, though most of our participants preferred to see a counsellor, a generalist counsellor, or to contact a helpline. I think this is even though it's a small little finding, I think it's really critical in terms of our implications and future work about possibly trying to work with culturally and linguistically diverse services to build up their cultural competency around sexuality and gender diversity, and likewise to work with LGBTIQ services to build up their cultural competency around culturally and linguistically diverse experiences. So I think I'll hand back to Erdem now to have a chat about some implications of the research.
Sure. So the wealth of data that has been collected from our survey and interview participants provides ample evidence to begin addressing some of the concerns raised by our participants. Importantly, many of the participants noted that their own suggestions for creating more supportive families and communities for SGD CALD people in Greater Western Sydney. Below, we provide an outline of those strategies that the participants and researchers believe will make the most difference for participants' lives. So in terms of legal reform, something important would be to lobby to make conversion therapy illegal in New South Wales. The Western Sydney Queer Collective and other student groups have already been involved in something similar by taking a stand against the Conversion Therapy Forum that's going to be held in Victoria, with Western Sydney University's own Professor John Whitehall as a panellist. In support services, alternative, affordable and accessible supported living arrangements for those exiled from family homes, an increase in professional services in Greater Western Sydney to support families of sexuality and gender diverse people, and informal support groups for CALD families, and for services to be provided with information, training and resources about the unique forms of family violence experienced by sexuality and gender diverse people, such as conversion therapy, forced marriage, threats of deportation, corrective rape, and interfamilial hate crimes. Services should also be educated about the impacts of minority stress and trauma on clients. For the general community, some recommendations are increase support and education to Western Sydney communities to destigmatise and myth bust regarding sexuality and gender diverse people and the issues they face. Training and awareness raising with cultural and religious organisations and groups about sexuality and gender diverse CALD people's experiences, especially in terms of loss of culture or religion when exiled from family or culture. And to propose to Mardi Gras and into Pride Preliminary work is done ahead of Sydney's World Pride in 2023 to work with Greater Western Sydney communities. Work is already being done in this space with ANTRA and 31 other queer groups or organisations to make sure that the 2023 World Pride is as welcoming and inclusive as possible to all ethnic groups. Within the SGD community, visibility of relatable positive stories to help SGD CALD people with feelings of isolation and to offer potential tools for helping them navigate challenging family life. My mother and I were invited to speak at the Home is Where the Story Begins event, which is held on the 15th of May. Our story was actually really positive as I now have a very warm and accepting family after dealing with a few years of stress after coming out. I believe visible, happy people with positive stories act as a beacon of hope for queer individuals that are trying to understand how their sexuality will impact their life. Having events, programs, and media materials that are genuinely accessible, relevant, and representative, and they should avoid tokenism. Community organizations should ensure that sexuality and gender diverse CALD people are represented in leadership roles and should take active steps to be inclusive, for example, establishing an anti-racism policy. And while I just mentioned avoiding tokenism, I need to note that in my own life, whenever I saw a symbol of queer allyship, such as a rainbow flag on the door of a cafe, or more recently, the fact that Sydney buses had been completely covered in rainbow design, I did for a moment feel more secure in my sexuality and my place in Sydney. And I believe that if these symbols did make their way into Greater Western Sydney, it would offer a sense of welcome to the queer community. And finally, resourcing and support to exist sexuality and gender diverse CALD community groups, such as SheQ, Bob Gays, Sydney Queer Muslims, and Triconi. This will support sexuality and gender diverse CALD people in Greater Western Sydney to develop peer connections, build community, and engage in community-led activities and events.
Thank you, Erdem.
Thank you.
And that finishes our presentation for today, and I look forward to questions, comments, anything else that you'd like to say.
All right, so a couple of people have typed questions, so we can respond to those. Do you want me to read that to you and then you can answer? So Rosie has asked, is there any work done alongside this to talk to the non-supportive and unsafe/violent family members in terms of worldview/ideology, and perhaps, and she's not 100% sure of how to phrase this, to think about how to address the problem without requiring vulnerable people to relive trauma in order to see change?
Yeah, this is something that we talked about straight after the Ida Hobbit event. Was some of our recommendations and some of the work that we're already doing is about providing forums in which CALD families can come together and talk about sexuality and gender diversity to support each other through that process and to talk about perhaps some of the culturally specific issues that they may have. Trying to get to non-supportive and violent family members is going to be much more difficult. And we don't want to rush doing that research. I think it is an incredible thing that we need to get to those people to find out what are their concerns, what are the barriers for inclusion, and what can we do to support them in changing, or not necessarily changing their ideas, but possibly becoming more inclusive of their sexuality and gender diverse family members. I think the only way we could do that is to do it through forums within communities, within CALD communities, to come along to discuss the issues and then possibly have a focus group to get some responses back. But trying to get to those hostile families would be really, really difficult. I think that would be a hard to reach, in a hard to reach, into hard reach, into hard to reach community.
Erdem, anything, or we can move to the next question? I think it's, yeah, I think that speaks to a generally tricky research issue, which is accessing the kind of the problem community, right? So I'm looking at men who use violence and have white supremacist ideas, you know, how do you access that population to interview them about how you can change their ideas? Or offer alternative narratives? It's a tricky one. So you end up consistently looking at victims or survivors rather than the perpetrators of problems, which I think is...
And I think that kind of, both your research and looking at hostile CALD families in terms of sexuality and gender diverse, is that that's enormous amounts of emotional and psychological labour on behalf of the researchers to engage with people who may in fact hate you. So yes, it's high cost research.
Absolutely. So we have a second question from Gia, who has left, but this is being recorded so Gia can access the question at a later time. Gia said, really great stuff, and I commend this important research project. I have to run to another meeting, but I wondered how CALD queer youth saw their predicament and the situation in Western Sydney in a broader context of structural inequality at all, and how the overall political context of Australia contributed to their experiences, including the relative invisibility of queer issues in the national discourse. Perhaps you can tell me next time. And I noticed the video had that one participant saying they don't trust the government.
No, there was high levels of distrust, not only of the government, but also of sexuality and gender diverse organisations and services. Quite a few of our participants talked about the needing to weigh up, do I deal with the racism of the white queer community, or do I deal with the heterosexism and cissexism of their own cultural community? And it was this constant weighing up of these two. In terms of the more structural disadvantage, you know, we're talking about Greater Western Sydney, which, you know, has some of the highest rates of unemployment, lowest salaries, all of those sorts of things. I think we need to, one of the outcomes from this research is we've been approached by quite a few stakeholders and service organisations wanting to expand the research and to look at replicating the research for all communities so that we can get a sense of possibly what are some of the structural issues for those that are culturally and linguistically diverse, but also those who live in poverty, who live with economic disadvantage. So I think going forward, we need to add in questions around economics, around salaries. We can analyse stuff by postcode, but postcode sometimes hides poverty or highlights poverty. So I think we need to expand those questions if we do the larger study of all SGD people. Sorry, and yes, SGD is now the term preferred. I've been using it for about 10 years now, but ACON is now moved from LGBTIQA+ to sexuality and gender diverse, just so that makes it easier on the tongue at least.
That question was because there was a typo of FGD in the Q&As, and I was like, what is this new FGD term? But just yesterday I was talking to somebody else about the transition to SGD and the nature of it as an inclusive term, because it doesn't list a lot of letters and then run the risk of people feeling just added on with that plus. Okay, we have a third question from Chris Townley, the amazing glue that holds Sega together.
Yay, Chris.
Chris says, great presentation, thanks. I'm on another Western Sydney project with WSU and ACON, where we're about to analyse a survey data set from SGD people in Western Sydney. As we know, CALD is a big umbrella term. Do you have any advice from your experience in this project as to useful ways of comparing culturally and linguistically diverse and non-culturally and linguistically diverse responses? How could we define CALD and non-CALD, either as general groups or in different ways to approach different questions, particularly to understand people's experiences and what service providers can do better? Oh, academic questions.
Oh, big question. So we led from the perspective of it was self-identification in terms of both sexuality and gender diversity and cultural and linguistic diversity. We had inclusion criteria that said, do you identify as culturally and linguistically diverse? And interestingly, we had one participant who said yes and is Indigenous. We also had within the survey, we said, you know, where were you born? Where was your mother born? Where was your father born? And we tried to be respectful of all of the cultural diversity that may happen within that. So if you go to the ABS actually has a position paper on cultural and linguistic diversity, and they suggest asking 12 questions. that to even capture this sense of cultural and linguistic diversity, we have to ask 12 separate questions. And obviously that's not going to run in a survey where we don't want people dropping out of the survey. So we asked for our participants to self-identify that information. And in doing so, we almost made it impossible for us to actually analyse the data in terms of nationality or cultural identity. What we ended up doing was to use, again, the ABS guidance and to talk about regions rather than countries of birth. So Asia, Africa, etc. When we looked at it in that way, what we found was that there was key differences between European CALD people and Asian and Pacific, that those were the three really distinct patterns. We only had one participant from an African nation, so we couldn't actually say too much about that. But we did find that there was quite a distinctive difference between particularly Asia and Pacific, and between Asia, Pacific and Europe. We haven't discussed that at length in our report, and maybe that's something that we need to tease out a little bit more, but finding how to ask those questions in a culturally appropriate way that is then also methodologically robust and able to be used is, I think, an ongoing issue. It's not going to be solved anytime soon.
Thank you. Excellent answer. The ever dramatic issue of choosing survey questions, the political issue of survey questions. Did you make those decisions as a group, those survey questions?
I think we initially had, here's a drop-down list, and then made the decision not to go with that just because people from mixed heritage, how do they identify? We don't want to label somebody as something if they don't actually identify as that just because of where they were born. But coming back to the end of that question from Chris, in terms of service providers, I think the most critical finding that we had from this was that SGD services need to be woken in a big way, that they need to look at the way in which cultural and linguistic diversity is represented within their organisations, but also who has positions of power to set agendas. And if we don't have people of colour within those agenda setting groups, then these issues will never get onto the agenda. We will never get to capture what those experiences are. Equally, we need to work with the culturally and linguistically diverse services to train them up around sexuality and gender diversity, and that's something that that ACON and the interagency do as an ongoing matter every month during their meetings.
Cool. We have a question from Colin Ellis, who says, you mentioned that SGD CALD people have concerns using CALD services. So follows up beautifully. Does this include interpreter services used in healthcare settings or when attending healthcare services / providers where they could be exposed to those within their own communities?
It wasn't specifically talked about in terms of health service providers, but there was, I think, one or two participants that talked about that they would not engage with translation services or CALD community services simply because of the small degree of separation between members within that community. Interestingly, when we first drafted the report, every quote had gender, sexuality, religion, and cultural background. And after we had a few CALD people, stakeholders review that information, they asked us to take off at least one of those demographics because by providing all four, there would be some people who would be recognisable from even those anonymous comments. So yeah, it's really important that we think about the safety of our participants. I think there is already been work done with translation services about trying to build up their capacity around sexuality and gender diversity. But I think with translation services, it's just potluck who you get. And you don't know whether you're going to get somebody who is at least tolerant.
Thank you. Erdem, any comments to add to any of the discussion? You're welcome to pop in at any time.
Okay. I will respond to that as well. Look, I obviously don't have any statistics or anything, but I could think about myself and with my community. If someone was speaking to me in Turkish, if I needed a translator, I would feel very uncomfortable, because I know that within the space of Greater Western Sydney, lots of people who are from my culture know each other. And so I would assume that I would just be like, oh, I'm going to go. You know, so I wouldn't feel comfortable with that. So I think, yeah, there is something we need to do about that.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. All right, so the next question is from Prue Adams. Thank you, Nicole and Erdem. You mentioned that younger participants identified their sexual diversities using a wider range of terms. Were there any findings in terms of family responses for younger participants?
Oh, we haven't analysed that. We haven't looked at whether it was, because I would get a sense that there would be a generational shift with younger CALD people maybe experiencing more tolerant and accepting families, but we haven't analysed the data, and I promise I will do so.
Eventually.
Eventually.
I have, as the facilitator, I'm shamelessly going to have the last question. So I was wondering, you opened this presentation for academics rather than stakeholders, I guess, talking about ethics. And I was just wondering if you felt, I'm on the ethics committee and I'm fascinated by all of this stuff and have been having a lot of discussions lately with other people on ethics committees about the way that demographic data is often dealt with, but also in terms of how some ethics committees can be a bit overzealous when it comes to vulnerable populations. Did you find some of the responses problematic or overzealous perhaps because they're thinking this is inherently vulnerable community?
Overzealous, perhaps because I work in policing and criminal justice. Every single research project I do is high risk and problematic. And what I've found, particularly with our ethics committee, anything that may include a disclosure of a crime, whether it is against the person or they have committed it, raises the risk even higher. We submitted our protocol and got back a reviewer's document that was about 5 pages long. And that was when we integrated the safety checklist to try and cover off quite a few of those comments. But there was a sense from me that the ethics committee thought I was a nice white middle class lady trying to do research in a field that I have no connection to. And perhaps what we need to be doing in our ethics protocols, in that section where it says, you know, what skills do you have to conduct this research, that we actually start up naming our positionality in that statement to bypass some of the comments. And it was really interesting, you know, this was for a different project, the Scholarship Disabled project, and I had written disabled people such and such and such and such, and one of the reviewers' comments was, I am deeply offended that you call these people disabled people. They are people with disability. And I had to write back and say, I'm sorry, I'm a disabled woman and I'd prefer to be called disabled, not somebody with a disability. But there's a whole lot of perhaps white middle class assumptions on ethics committees about who's doing the research and for what purposes.
The assumption that you're nice, I mean, that's crazy. Thank you, and that's really helpful actually, and I think you're right that it's a problem when a committee doesn't have people with expertise in an exact subdiscipline for a start. And yeah, did you feel that so I thought it was really interesting that you did that checklist for participants. Was that before the survey that they had to do the checklist?
Yeah, after the inclusion criteria and before the consent, we did the safety checklist. And I've now integrated into every single ethics protocol so I can just bypass getting the reviewers' comments saying you're not protecting the safety of your participants.
And do you honestly, on the record, think that that was necessary, or did you do that for fulfilling an ethics?
I actually think now it was important for this survey because there was 6 people after completing that checklist who made the decision not to proceed with the survey.
Okay.
So even if we just protected 6 people, I think it was an important aspect to it.
So interesting. Thank you. If you
and happy to share those checklists so you've got a sense of what the ethics committee will approve.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, do you have any closing comments, you two?
This is just the first step. We've just identified, this is the first ever study of CALD SGD people in Australia. There were very few participants, so we cannot say this is representative of those communities, but it is the first step. It's got the issue on the agenda, and stakeholders are now contacting us about how they can apply those findings to their own organisations. So I think that's the best thing about it.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. It's an incredible project. The videos and the resources you made are just such a great outcome of like an academic project. It's really impressive. So thank you for taking the time to...
And can I direct everybody to Say It Out Loud /home is. So Say It Out Loud is the main site for ACON around safety and inclusion. And we've got a whole web page there with resources, and that will be constantly updated as we go along.
Amazing. Thank you. Everybody who's attending, please, I'm shamelessly going to plug our Twitter @SexGenderWSU, and keep your eye out for next month, which will be the last Wednesday of June. We will have another webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy and Chris.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Sorry, I'm just reading the comments.